When was the last time someone asked you something, and you answered with anything just to avoid saying, "I don't know"? Perhaps a somewhat vague explanation. Perhaps an opinion expressed with more confidence than certainty. Or maybe a simple, "I think so," just to avoid that uncomfortable silence. Have you ever been through this? The truth is, saying "I don't know" seems simple, almost innocent. But, for the human brain, that phrase is much heavier than it appears. It sounds like failure, like a loss of control, like exposure. And that's exactly why often we prefer to be wrong, or even invent things, rather than admit ignorance. What you're about to discover may surprise you, because this behavior is not a moral failing, nor a lack of intelligence. It's a profound reflection of how the brain works. From the very first seconds of life, the brain is trying to make sense of the world. It observes patterns, creates explanations, anticipates what comes next. This need to understand everything is not pure curiosity, it's survival. For the brain, not knowing means being vulnerable. It means not being able to predict the next step. And predictability, for it, is synonymous with security. That's why not knowing generates real discomfort, both physical and emotional. Perhaps you've felt this before, that inner unease when a question goes unanswered. That strange feeling that something is open-ended. The brain hates gaps. It hates explanatory silence. And when a question arises without a clear answer, the system goes on alert. It's as if something is out of place. Stay with me until the end, because understanding this mechanism completely changes how you view your own decisions. The most curious thing is that the brain doesn't demand a correct answer. It demands any answer. Something that closes the story. Something that restores the feeling of control. That's why quick explanations, fragile certainties, and confident opinions wield so much power. They soothe. They give the illusion of understanding. Even when they are wrong. Even when they are nothing more than assumptions. Ultimately, the brain isn't constantly seeking absolute truth. It's seeking cognitive comfort. It's trying to reduce mental effort, doubt, and uncertainty. Admitting "I don't know" forces the brain to remain in an uncomfortable state for longer. It forces it to accept that something is out of its control. And that goes against everything it has learned to do throughout evolution. Perhaps now some situations will begin to make sense. Discussions where no one wants to give in. People defending flimsy ideas with extreme conviction. Improvised explanations that sound convincing but don't hold up. All of this has the same root, the brain's fear of uncertainty. The fear of admitting that you don't know. And here's an important detail. This fear doesn't depend on intellectual level. Intelligent, experienced, educated people, all are subject to this mechanism. Because it doesn't originate in rational thought. It originates in deeper layers of the brain, linked to emotion, identity, and belonging. Saying "I don't know" can sound internally like "I am less capable," even if that's not true. Have you ever noticed how much easier it is to accept a wrong explanation than to have no explanation at all? How simple stories seem more appealing than complex or inconclusive answers. This is no coincidence. It's the brain doing exactly what it does best, protecting you from the discomfort of doubt. But what happens when this need to appear knowledgeable begins to shape our decisions, our beliefs, and even our worldview? And why, paradoxically, might learning to tolerate "I don't know" be one of the greatest signs of intelligence? That's what we're starting to explore now. And perhaps, as you listen to all this, some personal situation has already come to mind. A moment when you defended an idea simply because it seemed right. Or a conversation where admitting "I don't know" seemed too difficult. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. It could be an experience, a question, or even that strange feeling of recognizing this pattern in yourself. When you comment, you're not just talking to me, you're opening up space for other people to realize they're not alone in this. This kind of exchange creates something powerful: community. Different people with different stories, realizing that the human brain shares the same flaws, the same shortcuts, and the same fears. And that completely changes the way we learn. So, if at any point in this video you thought, "That's me," click the like button. It seems simple, but this gesture shows the algorithm, and me, that this type of content is really worth continuing to create. And if you're curious about how the brain works, about those strange phenomena of the human mind that no one really explains, subscribe to the channel. It's not just to keep up with future videos. It's to be part of a space where questioning, doubting, and saying "I don't know" isn't weakness, it's a starting point. Your subscription helps this content reach more people who may also be trying to understand why they think, feel, and decide the way they do. Because ultimately, this channel only exists because of curious people like you. People who don't want ready-made answers, but want to understand the mechanisms behind them. Your participation here is what makes this conversation continue, grow, and reach further and further. And the more people join this reflection, the more relevant it becomes. Now, from here we need to take it a step further. Because understanding that the brain hates admitting "I don't know" is just the beginning. What really matters is discovering what happens inside the mind when uncertainty arises, and why, in many cases, it triggers much deeper reactions than we imagine. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the discomfort of saying, "I don't know," isn't just psychological, nor just social. It's physical. It happens in the body. It happens in the brain. When uncertainty arises, it's not just an abstract idea floating in the mind, it's a real, measurable internal state that activates ancient, automatic systems that are extremely sensitive to the feeling of threat. When the brain encounters something it cannot explain, predict, or fit into a known pattern, it goes into alert mode. Areas linked to anxiety, stress, and vigilance begin to work more intensely. It's as if the brain interprets not knowing as a sign of imminent danger. Something like, "If I don't understand what's happening, I can't protect myself." And, from an evolutionary point of view, this makes perfect sense. For most of human history, not knowing meant risk. Not knowing what that noise in the woods was. Not knowing if that plant was edible. Not knowing if that stranger posed a threat. Uncertainty was not neutral, it could be fatal. So the brain learned, over thousands of years, to react quickly whenever faced with the unknown. It prefers an imperfect explanation to no explanation at all. It prefers a hasty conclusion to the emptiness of doubt. This is where "I don't know" starts to hurt, because it signals a loss of control. The brain hates the feeling of not being in command of the situation. Control, for it, isn't about absolute power, it's about predictability. When something deviates from the prediction, an internal friction arises. A tension. A discomfort that's difficult to name but very easy to feel. Perhaps you recognize this as restlessness, mild anxiety, impatience, or even irritation for no apparent reason. Furthermore, not knowing is interpreted as risk. Risk of making a mistake later. Risk of appearing incompetent. Risk of making bad decisions. And the brain is, above all, a risk manager. It is constantly calculating probabilities, evaluating scenarios, trying to minimize losses. When there is not enough data, when there is no clear answer, this system becomes overloaded. It's as if the brain were saying, "I don't like this unstable terrain." But perhaps the most delicate point is vulnerability. Admitting "I don't know" exposes a flaw, a gap, an incompleteness. And the brain associates vulnerability with the possibility of exclusion, rejection, or diminished status. Even if this doesn't actually happen, the mere possibility is enough to activate defensive mechanisms. That's where improvised answers, exaggerated certainties, and explanations that seem firm on the outside but are fragile on the inside come from. None of this is mental laziness. None of this is a lack of interest in the truth. It's survival. It's the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do: reduce threat, restore balance, protect the integrity of the system. The problem begins when these mechanisms, which were useful in hostile and unpredictable environments, start to interfere with how we deal with information, decisions, and personal transformation in the modern world. Because today, many of the situations that trigger this discomfort don't represent real danger. A question in a meeting. An informal discussion. A complex topic that we haven't yet mastered. Yet, the brain reacts as if it were facing something critical. It doesn't clearly distinguish between physical and symbolic threats. For it, losing control, status, or predictability activates similar alarms. That's why decisions are so often made too quickly. Not because the person is certain, but because they need to alleviate the discomfort of uncertainty. That's why simple narratives are so seductive, even when they hide a more complex, hidden truth. The brain prefers a wrong map to walking without one at all. At least the map gives a sense of direction. This dynamic has a direct impact on how we construct beliefs, opinions, and even identity. When an explanation takes hold, even a weak one, it creates a feeling of relief. The brain relaxes. Tension decreases. And this relief acts as a reward. Gradually, the explanation begins to be defended not because it is true, but because it is comfortable. Questioning it would mean reopening the wound of uncertainty. Returning to the state of "I don't know." And the brain avoids this whenever possible. This is where a silent, almost imperceptible transformation begins. The need to avoid discomfort starts to shape the mindset. It begins to influence choices, decisions, judgments. The brain starts to filter information not by the criterion of truth, but by the criterion of emotional impact. What is too threatening is rejected. What is calming is accepted. even if it is not solid. Behind the scenes of the mind, this logic operates all the time. It doesn't announce its intentions. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply happens. And the less aware we are of it, the more it directs our reactions. Questioning becomes attack. Doubt becomes discomfort. Complexity becomes something to be avoided. And, little by little, the journey of learning transforms into a journey of defending certainties. But understanding this mechanism already changes something important. Because when you understand that the discomfort of not knowing is an automatic response from the brain, you stop confusing yourself with it. You realize that this tension is not a sign of weakness, but a sign that something new is trying to emerge. That a boundary is being crossed. That a revelation may be near, if there is room to tolerate the uncertainty for a few more moments. This tolerance doesn't arise from nothing. It's built. And it starts right here. Recognizing that discomfort exists, that it's real, that it has deep roots, but that it doesn't need to dictate all our decisions. Because the moment you can endure a little longer of, I don't know, something different begins to happen within your mind. A space opens up. A fertile silence. A terrain where new questions can emerge. And it is precisely at this point that things get even more interesting. Because when the brain cannot quickly escape uncertainty, it activates other pathways. Other processes. Other ways of dealing with the unknown that we rarely use in our daily lives. If all of this made sense to you so far, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because understanding the brain as a prediction machine completely changes how you interpret this discomfort of not knowing. The brain is not a passive organ waiting for the world to happen and then reacting. It is constantly running simulations. It anticipates scenarios, calculates probabilities, projects consequences. Even before you consciously realize what is happening, the brain has already made silent bets on what comes next. In practice, this means that your mind lives a few seconds ahead of reality. It tries to predict the next sound, the next word, the next gesture, the next event. This mechanism is extremely efficient. It's what allows you to cross a street without thinking about each movement, understand sentences before they are finished, and recognize faces in fractions of a second. Prediction saves energy, reduces effort, and increases the feeling of control. For the brain, predicting is synonymous with safety. The problem begins when this mechanism encounters something that doesn't fit. A question without a clear answer. An unexpected event. Ambiguous information. At that moment, the prediction fails. And when the prediction fails, the brain understands that something has gone off script. The system goes on alert. Not because something bad is actually happening, but because something has ceased to be predictable. And unpredictability for the brain always carries a potential threat. This warning doesn't arise as a logical thought like, this is dangerous. It arises as a feeling. As an urgency. As an almost automatic need to restore meaning. That's why the brain rushes to fill in the gaps. It doesn't tolerate explanatory emptiness well. A space without meaning is perceived as too unstable. So any narrative that closes the story, even if incomplete or inaccurate, seems better than none at all. This is one of the most interesting behind-the-scenes aspects of the human mind. The search for meaning is not merely intellectual, it is emotional. When the brain cannot predict, it tries to explain. When it cannot explain based on solid data, it improvises. It creates quick connections. It uses past experiences, beliefs, mental shortcuts. The goal is not to arrive at the hidden truth, but to reduce the internal tension caused by the failure to predict. This dynamic has a huge impact on the decisions we make every day. Many choices are not made because they are the best, but because they eliminate uncertainty. Deciding something, anything, can be more comfortable than remaining in doubt. The mind feels relief when it chooses, even if it chooses poorly. Closure is rewarding. Prolonged openness is exhausting. That's why strong opinions emerge so quickly on complex topics. That's why simple explanations gain traction in matters that would require nuance. The brain prefers a coherent, albeit fragile, story to living with the feeling of not understanding. The predictability of the narrative matters more than its precision. And this doesn't happen due to a lack of intelligence, but due to an excessive need for internal stability. When you observe this closely, you begin to realize how much this prediction machine shapes our mindset. It influences how we interpret news, how we judge people, how we react to new ideas. What fits existing predictions is easily accepted. What breaks the pattern generates resistance. Not because it's false, but because it requires extra cognitive effort to integrate. This mechanism also explains why profound changes are often so uncomfortable. Transformation requires abandoning old predictions before having new ones ready. It requires going through a period of uncertainty. And the brain doesn't like this interval. It feels like it's losing its footing. That's why, often, it clings to what it already knows, even if it's not working so well. The predictable familiar wins over the promising unknown. Behind the scenes of this mental journey, there is a constant negotiation between comfort and growth. Growing requires tolerating the failure of predictions. It requires accepting that the old map no longer serves, but that the new one has not yet been drawn. This interval is where "I don't know" takes hold most strongly. And it is precisely there that the brain tries to escape, offering quick answers, hasty conclusions, improvised certainties. But there's a crucial detail that's rarely noticed. When the brain is forced to remain in this state of uncertainty for a little longer, it begins to activate other resources. It slows down. It observes more closely. It makes room for information that would otherwise be discarded. The initial urgency for meaning gives way to a deeper curiosity. It's as if, little by little, the mind leaves defensive mode and enters exploratory mode. This transition doesn't happen automatically. It requires awareness. It requires recognizing the impulse to close the story too quickly. It requires acknowledging the anxiety that arises when the prediction fails. And, above all, it requires not confusing this discomfort with real danger. Because, in most modern situations, the risk isn't in not knowing. The risk lies in clinging too early to any explanation just to relieve tension. When you understand that the brain is always trying to predict the world, you begin to see your own reactions more clearly. Impatience with doubt. Irritation with open-ended questions. The attraction to definitive answers. All of this ceases to seem like a personality trait and begins to be seen as an automatic function. Something that can be observed, questioned, and, little by little, made more flexible. And it is precisely at this point that something begins to reveal itself. Because, when the urgency for meaning diminishes, space opens up for better questions. Questions that seek not only to close the story but to expand it. Questions that serve not only to calm the brain but to transform it. It is in this space that more conscious decisions become possible. It is in this interval that the mindset truly begins to change. This ability to linger a little longer in the unknown doesn't eliminate the need for predictions. The brain will continue to predict. It's part of who we are. But the relationship with uncertainty changes. It ceases to be seen merely as a threat and begins to be recognized as a fertile ground for discovery. A territory where important revelations can emerge, provided there is a willingness not to immediately rush to find the first available answer. And this is where the conversation begins to take on another layer. Because understanding how the brain reacts when prediction fails is only part of the story. There is something even deeper happening when we try to protect our sense of certainty at all costs. If this resonates with you, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because here we enter one of the most revealing behind-the-scenes aspects of how the human mind works. When the brain faces a gap, something it doesn't understand, can't explain, or can't predict, it rarely accepts this void in silence. Instead it acts. And it acts quickly. It creates assumptions. It improvises explanations. It builds certainties that seem solid on the outside, but which were born only to close the uncomfortable gap of "I don't know." The brain doesn't like unfinished stories. A cognitive gap is like an open wound in the prediction system. And to close it, it doesn't demand precision, it demands coherence. Any narrative that connects the dots, even if the dots are wrong, is enough to restore a minimal sense of control. It is at this moment that assumptions come into play. They arise almost automatically, based on past experiences, personal beliefs, opinions, or even what everyone seems to think. These assumptions don't go through a rigorous verification filter. They go through an emotional filter. The silent question isn't, "Is this true?" but "Does this alleviate the discomfort?" If the answer is yes, the brain accepts it. And when it accepts it, it does something even more powerful. It begins to treat that assumption as if it were knowledge. The improvised explanation becomes a reference. The hypothesis becomes certainty. And the feeling of relief functions as an internal reward. This is how false certainties are born. Not as a conscious lie but as an adaptation. The brain prefers a weak explanation to remaining exposed to uncertainty. Staying in the "I don't know" state requires effort, attention, and tolerance for discomfort. Inventing requires less energy. It's quick, efficient, and emotionally comfortable. From the brain's point of view, it seems like an obvious choice. The most curious thing is that these improvised stories don't need to be complex. The simpler, the better. The brain loves clear narratives with a beginning, middle, and end. The less ambiguity, the greater the feeling of stability. That's why simplistic explanations tend to spread so easily. They offer immediate closure. They say, relax, we already understand this. Even when we don't. Behind the scenes of the mind, this creates a ripple effect. An improvised explanation, when repeated a few times, begins to sound familiar. And familiarity, for the brain, is easily confused with truth. The more an idea circulates, the more comfortable it becomes. The more comfortable it is, the less it is questioned. And, at that point, the false certainty is no longer just an assumption. It becomes identity, opinion, position. This mechanism helps explain why erroneous theories spread so easily. They don't win because they are more true, but because they are more comfortable. They offer quick answers to difficult questions. They reduce collective anxiety in the face of the unknown. They give the feeling that the chaos has been organized, that the mystery has been solved, that the hidden truth has finally come to light, even when this has not actually happened. When you observe this closely, you realize the profound impact of this phenomenon on human decisions. Many choices are made to preserve internal consistency, not to seek complete reality. Changing your mind requires dismantling an already constructed narrative. It requires reopening the gap. It requires returning to a state of uncertainty. And the brain strongly resists this because it feels it is losing something it had already achieved. Emotional stability. This resistance is not rational. It happens before conscious thought. It's a reflex. An automatic self-protection mechanism. That's why confronting a false certainty usually generates intense reactions. Not because the person is defending the truth, but because they are defending the comfort that explanation brought. Questioning the story is, for the brain, a threat to internal equilibrium. This is a delicate point in the human journey. Because, while these fleeting stories help us move forward, they can also imprison us. They shape rigid mindsets. They influence hasty judgments. They create shortcuts that seem efficient but limit perception. And the longer they remain intact, the harder it becomes to see beyond them. There's something almost invisible happening in this process. Every time the brain chooses to invent instead of admitting ignorance, it reinforces a pattern. A pattern of avoiding doubt. A pattern of closing questions too quickly. A pattern that, over time, begins to operate on its own without being questioned. The person feels that they always knew, when in reality they've simply become accustomed to their own explanation. But when this mechanism is brought to consciousness, something begins to change. The person realizes that that certainty did not arise from deep investigation, but from an emotional need for closure. They realize that many convictions were built to relieve tension, not to reveal reality. And this realization in itself already initiates a silent transformation. Because the moment you recognize that inventing can be comfortable but limiting, a new possibility arises. The possibility of pausing. Of observing the impulse to respond too quickly. Of feeling the discomfort without immediately running away from it. This space, although uncomfortable at first, is where genuine curiosity begins to emerge. It's where more honest questions appear. It's where more conscious decisions become possible. This change doesn't happen all at once. It's a journey. A process of learning to live with the unfinished, the provisional, the not yet. And paradoxically, it is in this uncertain territory that many of the deepest revelations emerge. Not because the brain has finally found the perfect answer, but because it has learned to sustain the question for longer. And when that happens, something interesting begins to unfold. Because the brain doesn't just create stories, it also creates images of itself. And admitting ignorance directly affects that image. It touches the ego, the identity, the way we want to be seen. That's where even more subtle forces come into play, helping to explain why some certainties are defended with such intensity. If this passage resonated with you, leave a comment below. That explains a lot. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because here we touch on one of the most powerful illusions the brain creates, the illusion of trust. There is a huge difference between seem to know want to know for real. However, for the brain, this difference isn't always clear. In fact, it often confuses superficial signs of security with real knowledge, and it does so automatically, silently, without us realizing it. The brain doesn't evaluate truth solely by content. It evaluates it by form, by fluency, by familiarity, by repetition. If an idea is expressed easily, without hesitation, with well-chosen words, the brain interprets this as mastery of the subject. Verbal fluency becomes a cognitive shortcut. If a person speaks well, they must know what they're talking about. This judgment happens in milliseconds, even before any deeper analysis. The curious thing is that fluency doesn't require deep understanding. It can come from memorization, mechanical repetition, or constant exposure to an idea. Someone can confidently repeat a concept several times without ever truly reflecting on it. Even so, the brain, both the speakers and the listeners, tends to accept it as legitimate knowledge. The feeling of security replaces verification. Familiarity works in a similar way. The more an idea is heard, the more comfortable it becomes. And comfort, for the brain, is usually interpreted as truth. This creates a subtle but profound effect. Repeated ideas begin to seem obvious. And when something seems obvious, it is rarely questioned. The brain thinks, if this has always been here, if everyone says this, it must be true. But familiarity is not evidence. It's just a mental habit. Repetition closes this cycle. An idea repeated many times in different contexts by different people creates a sense of solidity, even if it has never been tested, explored in depth, or challenged. The brain confuses frequency with validity. What appears often gains the status of reality. This is how fragile certainties transform into seemingly unquestionable truths. Behind the scenes of the mind, this generates a curious phenomenon. The more comfortable an idea becomes, the less the brain feels the need to examine it. Cognitive effort decreases. Curiosity recedes. The question, is that really so? Gives way to the automatic affirmation, it's always been that way. And, without realizing it, the person begins to defend a position not because they understand it deeply but because it sounds right. This illusion of confidence has a huge impact on the decisions we make. Many choices are guided by what seems solid, not by what is well-founded. In moments of doubt, the brain seeks external signs of security. Who speaks more firmly? Who shows less hesitation? Who seems certain? This creates a dangerous distortion, because apparent confidence is not synonymous with real knowledge. What's most unsettling is that the speaker's own brain can fall into this trap. By repeating an idea several times, by hearing it echo in different environments, they begin to believe they know more than they actually do. Fluency generates a false sense of mastery. Familiarity creates an illusion of depth. And little by little, the person stops noticing the gaps in their own understanding. The I don't know disappears not because knowledge has increased, but because the perception of ignorance has diminished. This directly interferes with mindset. When someone believes they already know, the learning journey ends prematurely. Questions cease to arise. Doubts are seen as bothersome. Questioning seems like a threat. The brain, comfortable in its illusion of certainty, begins to protect that position. And any information that challenges it is treated as noise, exaggeration, or error. This mechanism explains why so many discussions become unproductive. It's not an exchange of ideas but a clash of apparent certainties. Each side sounds confident. Each side repeats familiar arguments. And, for the brain of those involved, that's enough. Confidence in one's own narrative generates such a strong sense of internal coherence that the possibility of being wrong is hardly considered. But there's something even deeper happening here. Apparent confidence doesn't just protect ideas, it protects identity. Admitting you don't know something you've always asserted with certainty requires internal reorganization. It requires acknowledging a flaw in your own personal history. And the brain resists this. It prefers to maintain the illusion of mastery rather than face the instability of revising beliefs. This is a crucial point in personal transformation. Because growing intellectually isn't just about accumulating information, but about learning to differentiate fluency from comprehension, familiarity from truth, repetition from evidence. It's about realizing that sounding confident doesn't mean being right, and that hesitation can be a sign of cognitive honesty, not weakness. When this distinction begins to become clear, something changes in the way you listen to the world. You start paying attention not only to what is said but to how it was constructed. You notice when an explanation is elegant but shallow. When a certainty is comfortable but fragile. And, above all, when the brain is accepting something simply because it reduces the discomfort of not knowing. This awareness doesn't eliminate the illusion of confidence. The brain will continue to create shortcuts. But it creates a space between impulse and acceptance. A small interval where the question can arise, do I really understand this, or have I just become accustomed to this idea? This interval is powerful. It opens up space for decisions that are more aligned with reality, not just with mental comfort. And the more this space expands, the clearer a disturbing perception becomes. Many of the certainties we hold do not arise from deep understanding, but from repetition, habit, and emotional need. Recognizing this does not weaken the mind, it strengthens it. Because it restores something essential that the illusion of confidence often steals. Genuine curiosity. This is where the conversation begins to touch on something even more sensitive. Because when apparent confidence begins to crumble, What is exposed is not just momentary ignorance, but the ego. The image we have of ourselves as people who know, who understand, who are in control. And the brain has an intense relationship with this image. If this passage sparked any internal reflection, please comment below. That made me think. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because here the conversation stops being just about brain function and enters a much more sensitive territory, the ego. It is at this point that everything intensifies. Because admitting "I don't know" doesn't just threaten an isolated idea. It threatens who we believe ourselves to be. The image we construct of ourselves. The internal story we tell ourselves about our competence, our intelligence, our worth. The ego is not something superficial. It is a psychological system that helps maintain internal coherence. It organizes memories, choices, positions, and decisions. It creates a stable narrative of the self. And the brain works all the time to protect this narrative. When a situation arises that requires saying "I don't know," the brain interprets this as a crack in this construction. A fissure in identity. Something that can disrupt the carefully maintained internal balance. That's why the discomfort is significant. Saying "I don't know" can sound internally like "I'm not capable, I don't belong, I'm not up to it." Even if we rationally know that this isn't true, the emotional brain doesn't work with that logic. It reacts to the symbolic impact. It associates momentary ignorance with a loss of personal value. And faced with this threat, it goes into defense mode. Status comes into play silently. In social, professional, or even informal settings, appearing knowledgeable confers position, authority, and respect. The brain learns this early on. It perceives that those who demonstrate confidence tend to be listened to more and validated. So it creates a powerful association. Knowing, or appearing to know, protects the place we occupy within the group. Admitting ignorance, on the other hand, can be interpreted as a demotion, as a loss of ground. Even when no one is judging, the brain acts as if they are. Social belonging is perhaps the most profound factor of all. The human brain is extremely sensitive to the possibility of exclusion. Throughout evolution, being outside the group meant real danger. Reduced survival. So any sign that threatens this belonging activates old alarms. Saying "I don't know" can feel like moving away from consensus, expectation, the norm. And the brain prefers to align itself with the group, even if it means accepting fragile certainties. Behind the scenes of this dynamic, the ego becomes a powerful filter of reality. Information that reinforces identity is welcome. Information that threatens it is rejected, no matter how solid it may be. The brain doesn't ask, "Is this true?" but "Does this protect me or expose me?" If it exposes me, it activates defense mechanisms. Rationalizations, justifications, attacks, subtle denials. This is where many discussions cease to be about suits and become about identity. Questioning an idea is felt as questioning the person. Disagreeing becomes a threat. The search for hidden truth gives way to the need to preserve one's internal image. And at this point, the brain clearly chooses the ego. Not because it is arrogant, but because it has been trained over thousands of years to protect the cohesion of the self. This protection comes at a cost. The more the ego is defended, the less space is left for real learning. Less openness to transformation. Less willingness to revise past decisions. The brain prefers to maintain a consistent narrative, even if limited, rather than face the discomfort of admitting that something needs to be rebuilt. Change begins to be perceived as a threat, not as an opportunity. The most interesting thing is that this ego defense happens even when no one is watching. Even in private thoughts. Even in silence. The mind creates internal justifications to preserve the self-image. "I already knew that. That's not so important. It's always been like this." These phrases function as small psychological shields. They prevent "I don't know" from reaching full consciousness. And gradually, something curious happens. The person begins to confuse internal coherence with truth. If something fits their identity, it seems right. If it challenges that identity, it seems wrong. Reality ceases to be evaluated by evidence and begins to be filtered by emotional comfort. The ego takes the wheel of decisions. And the brain, faithful to its role as protector, supports this choice. But there is a turning point in this journey. A moment when the excessive protection of the ego begins to generate more tension than relief. When maintaining certainty requires constant effort. When defending one's own position becomes exhausting. When that uncomfortable feeling arises that something doesn't quite add up. It is at this point that "I don't know" begins to reappear, not as an immediate threat, but as a possibility for relief. Admitting ignorance at this stage ceases to be a defeat and begins to resemble freedom. freedom from having to maintain a rigid image, freedom to explore new ideas without immediate commitment, freedom to allow one's mindset to expand. But this transition is not simple. It requires overcoming initial discomfort. It requires letting the ego relax for a few moments. At this moment, the brain is divided. On one side, the automatic impulse to protect itself. On the other, the subtle perception that the truth, even if uncertain, can be healthier than a fragile certainty. This internal tension is where many revelations occur. It is where transformation begins to take shape. Not as a dramatic event, but as a silent adjustment in the way one relates to one's own knowledge. When someone manages to sustain that space, that interval between not knowing and not needing to pretend to know, something changes profoundly. The ego ceases to be a rigid armor and becomes a more flexible point of reference. Identity doesn't disappear, but it becomes less threatened by questions. The brain begins to realize that truth doesn't need to destroy the self to exist. And it is precisely here that the conversation approaches something even more delicate. Because when the ego relaxes, when identity ceases to demand immediate certainties, new possibilities for seeing the world emerge. And along with them, a silent question begins to form. What happens when admitting "I don't know" ceases to be a threat and becomes a resource? If this resonated with you, leave a comment below. That hit hard. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything we've been talking about so far isn't just elegant theory or a philosophical interpretation of human behavior. This has been observed, tested, and repeated in the laboratory countless times in different contexts, cultures, and educational levels. When science begins to look closely at how people deal with error and ignorance, an uncomfortable pattern emerges clearly. The brain not only makes mistakes, it clings to error when that error protects the feeling of certainty. One of the most studied phenomena in this field is overconfidence. In various experiments, people are asked to answer objective questions, solve logical problems, or explain concepts. The interesting detail lies not only in the wrong answers, but in the level of confidence with which these answers are defended. The less a person knows about a subject, the greater their conviction that they know enough tends to be. Not because they are lying, but because the brain does not perceive its own limitations. In many of these studies, after the answer is given, participants receive clear evidence that they are wrong. Data, demonstrations, detailed explanations. Yet, a significant portion of people maintain their original position. They adjust their discourse, reinterpret the evidence, question the source, change the criteria, all to avoid having to say, "I don't know," or "I was wrong." The mistake itself is uncomfortable. But admitting ignorance seems to be even more threatening to the brain. There is something profoundly revealing in this. When confronted with contrary evidence, the brain should, theoretically, update its conclusion. But what often happens is the opposite. The defense intensifies. The person begins to argue with more energy, more emotion, more rigidity. This is not a character flaw. It is the brain entering self-preservation mode. It feels it is losing something important, the feeling of internal coherence. Some experiments show something even more curious. When people are warned beforehand that they can make mistakes, that mistakes are expected, and that there will be no judgment, resistance decreases. The brain relaxes a little. This indicates that the problem is not the mistake itself, but the symbolic impact of the mistake on identity. When identity is protected, the mind becomes more flexible. When it is threatened, it shuts down. In other studies, participants are given simple questions but are asked to explain in detail how something works. Initially, many appear extremely confident. But as they try to explain step by step, gaps begin to appear. Interestingly, even in the face of these obvious gaps, some people continue to claim that they know, they just can't explain it at that moment. The brain prefers to maintain the label of knowledge rather than accept its absence. This behavior reveals something important about the inner workings of the mind. The brain doesn't operate solely on facts. It operates on narratives about who we are. And being wrong threatens that narrative. Admitting "I don't know" requires a momentary revision of the internal image. It requires accepting that the journey of understanding has not yet reached a stable point. And the brain, which seeks stability all the time, resists this transitory state. There are experiments in which people are financially rewarded for changing their minds in the face of new evidence. Even so, many resist. This shows that rational logic is not the main driving force here. What is at stake is emotional. It's about identity. It's the need to preserve a sense of control over one's own mind and one's own place in the world. When we look at this data closely, it becomes clear why flawed theories, weak beliefs, and simplistic explanations have such an impact. They offer something the brain deeply values: closure. They eliminate doubt. They reduce cognitive effort. They restore the feeling that, now everything is explained. And that is extremely seductive, even when the explanation doesn't withstand deeper scrutiny. The brain hates being wrong because being wrong signals failure. But it hates even more admitting that it doesn't know because that signals something broader. Incompleteness. Indefiniteness. Instability. Error can be corrected while keeping one's identity intact. Ignorance cannot. Ignorance demands cognitive humility. It demands recognizing limitations. It demands suspending judgment. And that goes against the automatic tendency for self-protection. These experiments show that often, the brain prefers to fight to defend a wrong answer rather than accept the temporary void of not knowing. It prefers an uncomfortable but defined position to an open and uncertain territory. And this has profound consequences. It affects personal decisions, career choices, social stances, and even how we deal with new information. The impact of this on mindset is enormous. When someone believes they already know, even when they are wrong, the learning journey is interrupted. Curiosity diminishes. Openness closes. The brain begins to function more as a guardian of certainties than as an explorer of reality. And over time, this posture generates rigidity, conflict, and resistance to transformation. But these same studies also point to something promising. People who can better tolerate the initial discomfort of not knowing tend to learn more, revise beliefs more easily, and make decisions more aligned with reality. They are not less confident, they simply build confidence elsewhere. Not in the appearance of knowing, but in the ability to learn. This difference is subtle yet profound. It's the difference between defending an answer and investigating a question. Between protecting the ego and expanding perception. Between ending the story too quickly and allowing it to unfold gradually. It is in this space that the most transformative revelations emerge, those that change not only what we think but how we think. When the brain realizes that admitting ignorance doesn't lead to a loss of value, something reorganizes itself internally. Defenses decrease. Curiosity reappears. Mistakes cease to be a threat and become a signal. But reaching this point requires traversing uncomfortable territory, where "I don't know" still sounds strange, almost forbidden. And it is precisely in this territory that something even more interesting is happening, something that explains why some people manage to evolve intellectually throughout their lives while others remain stuck in the same certainties for decades. If this makes sense to you so far, comment below. This changes the way you see everything. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything that seems abstract, theoretical, or distant actually happens all the time in your daily life, in the simplest decisions and also in the most important ones. The fear of saying "I don't know" isn't limited to intellectual debates or complex topics. It silently infiltrates daily choices, shapes behaviors, defines paths, and often determines outcomes without you even realizing it. When the brain avoids uncertainty, it tends to decide too quickly. And quick decisions aren't always good decisions. Many choices are made not because they were well analyzed, but because they eliminate the discomfort of not knowing. Choosing any path may seem better than remaining still, reflecting, weighing possibilities. The brain feels relief upon deciding, even if the decision is poorly founded. The closure of doubt generates immediate comfort, and this comfort is often mistaken for success. This is how bad decisions accumulate. Not due to a lack of intelligence but due to an excess of internal urgency. The person decides before understanding. Opinions before investigating. Reacts before reflecting. And then you start to defend that choice strongly, because going back would mean admitting that you decided without knowing enough. The initial mistake transforms into emotional commitment. The brain begins to protect the decision as if it were part of its identity. Over time, this crystallizes rigid beliefs. Ideas that are not revisited. Opinions that are not questioned. Worldviews that become immune to new information. Not because they are true but because they provide stability. Questioning them would require giving up the psychological comfort they offer. It would require returning to a state of uncertainty. And the brain resists this intensely. These rigid beliefs affect how we interpret everything around us. Information that confirms what we already believe is easily accepted. Information that challenges these beliefs is discarded, minimized, or reinterpreted. The brain creates a bubble of internal coherence. Inside it, everything seems to make sense. Outside of it, everything seems threatening or wrong. Reality ceases to be explored and becomes filtered. This mechanism also explains many unnecessary conflicts. Discussions that escalate quickly. Disagreements that could be simple but become personal. When someone questions an idea that the brain uses as a basis for security, the reaction is not curiosity, it's defense. The conversation ceases to be about the topic and becomes about who is right. The ego goes on alert. The body reacts. The tone changes. And the dialogue transforms into a dispute. Many conflicts don't exist because people disagree, but because neither can sustain the "I don't know." If both could admit, even for a moment, that perhaps they don't have all the answers, the tension would decrease. But the brain prefers to protect the image of certainty. It prefers to win the argument rather than expand understanding. And so, small conflicts drag on, wear down relationships, and create unnecessary distance. The difficulty in learning is another direct consequence of this process. Learning requires acknowledging ignorance. It requires accepting that there is something that is not yet known. When the brain avoids this recognition, learning becomes superficial. The person accumulates information but does not delve deeper. They repeat concepts but do not integrate them. They speak confidently but do not truly understand. The learning journey becomes a collection of fragile certainties. Behind the scenes of the mind, the fear of "I don't know" creates a silent trap. The more a person believes they already know, the less open they are to new possibilities. The less open they are, the more rigid they become. And the more rigid they are, the harder it is to deal with changes, transformations, and new contexts. The brain clings to the known even when the known no longer works so well. This pattern impacts career choices, relationships, habits, and even financial decisions. Many people remain in unsatisfactory situations not because they don't see alternatives, but because admitting they don't know what the next step is seems too daunting. The brain prefers the predictability of known discomfort to the uncertainty of something new. Change requires going through a period of uncertainty. And that period is exactly what the brain tries to avoid. The most curious thing is that often the person feels they are being rational, that they are being firm, that they are being consistent. But behind this, there is a clear emotional motivation: to avoid the vulnerability of admitting limits. The brain creates elegant justifications for decisions that, deep down, were made to protect internal comfort. The hidden truth takes a back seat. The immediate emotional impact takes control. This dynamic repeats itself so many times that it becomes invisible. The person believes they are choosing freely when, in reality, they are reacting to an automatic discomfort. They are fleeing uncertainty. They are seeking emotional stability. And that is not wrong in itself. It is human. But when it goes unnoticed, it begins to silently control one's life. There is an important moment in this journey, when a person begins to perceive this pattern in themselves. When they recognize that many decisions were made to avoid "I don't know." This recognition is not comfortable. It generates a mixture of surprise, resistance, and sometimes relief. Because, while it reveals limitations, it also opens up space for something new, the possibility of choosing more consciously. From this point on, something begins to change in mindset. Doubt ceases to be seen merely as a threat and begins to be recognized as a sign of growth. Discomfort doesn't disappear, but it loses some of its power. The brain still prefers certainty, but it begins to tolerate questions. It starts to allow small intervals of not knowing without immediately going into defense mode. These intervals are precious. It is during them that decisions more aligned with reality become possible. It is during them that conflicts can be diffused before escalating. It is during them that learning ceases to be repetition and becomes transformation. Not because the brain has stopped avoiding discomfort, but because the person has learned to remain in it for a few more moments. It all begins with something seemingly simple, yet profoundly difficult: admitting, even internally, "I don't know." This gesture interrupts the automatic response. It creates a pause. It breaks the cycle of immediate defense. And in that pause, something new can emerge. A better question. A more conscious decision. A broader view of the situation. It is in this space that the journey begins to change direction. Because when the fear of not knowing diminishes, curiosity gains strength. And when curiosity takes the place of defense, the mind begins to operate in a different way. More open. More flexible. More prepared to deal with the complexity of the real world. And that's exactly where the conversation approaches a crucial point. Because admitting "I don't know" isn't just an intellectual act, it's an emotional exercise. An internal training. Something that can be developed. And when that happens, the impact goes far beyond isolated decisions. It transforms how you relate to your own mind. If this passage resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because here the logic is completely reversed. And it is precisely in this reversal that one of the most disconcerting revelations about human intelligence lies. Everything we have seen so far seems to point to a brain that avoids uncertainty, protects the ego, invents stories, and defends fragile certainties. But, paradoxically, when we observe the most intelligent, curious, and adaptable minds, we find exactly the opposite movement. These minds are not those that always have ready answers. They are not the ones that speak with the most firmness or display the most superficial confidence. They are the ones that can remain longer in the territory of, I don't know, without internal collapse. They tolerate uncertainty. They don't immediately interpret it as a threat. For the brains of these people, doubt is not a red alarm, it's an invitation. Tolerating uncertainty doesn't mean liking it. It means not automatically running away from it. It means being able to hold the question open long enough for something new to emerge. That extra time makes all the difference. While the average brain tries to close the story as quickly as possible, the smarter mind slows down. It observes. It tests hypotheses. It considers alternatives. It accepts that reality is more complex than a quick explanation. Questioning is another striking trait of this type of mindset. But it's not aggressive questioning used to attack or win debates. It's honest questioning which often begins with a silent acknowledgement, maybe I don't fully understand this yet. This type of question doesn't threaten the ego because the ego is no longer rigidly tied to the idea of always being right. Identity ceases to depend on fixed certainties and begins to rely on the ability to learn. And that's precisely why these minds learn faster. Not because they are faster in the traditional sense, but because they don't waste energy defending weak positions. They don't expend mental resources protecting improvised explanations. When new evidence emerges, it is evaluated. When an error is perceived, it is integrated. Learning happens because the brain isn't constantly busy defending itself. Behind the scenes of this dynamic, something important happens. I don't know ceases to be a sign of weakness and becomes a marker of openness. A provisional, fertile, creative state. It is in this space that deeper connections are made. It is there that the hidden truth, the one that doesn't appear in quick answers, begins to reveal itself. Not as absolute certainty, but as a more refined understanding of reality. This paradox often causes resistance when first heard. After all, we have been trained from an early age to associate intelligence with having answers, with demonstrating security, with appearing confident. Little is said about the intelligence of sustaining doubts, of revising convictions, of admitting limitations. But when we observe scientists, thinkers, inventors, and people who undergo great transformations throughout their lives, the pattern repeats itself. They all maintain a healthy relationship with not knowing. This relationship changes everything. It changes how decisions are made. Instead of deciding to alleviate anxiety, decisions are made to better understand. It changes how conflicts are faced. Instead of defending positions at all costs, space is created for listening. It changes how the personal journey is experienced. Instead of seeking final certainties, progressive clarity is sought. Perhaps the real problem was never not knowing. The problem may lie in pretending to know. Pretending to others but mainly to oneself. This pretense requires constant effort. It demands vigilance, defense, rigidity. It transforms any questioning into a threat. And little by little, it narrows perception, limits choices, and impoverishes the experience of learning. When someone abandons the need to pretend, something loosens up inside. The mind breathes. The brain, still cautious, begins to experience a new form of security, not based on certainties but on adaptability. The person realizes that they don't need to know everything to move forward. That they don't need immediate answers to make good decisions. That they can walk even without a complete map. This change isn't dramatic. It's silent. A mindset adjustment. A gradual transformation in how we relate to questions, mistakes, and doubts. I don't know begins to be seen as a natural part of the human journey, not as a personal failing. And interestingly, the more this space is accepted, the faster the learning process becomes. Because true learning requires dismantling old explanations before building new ones. It requires going through periods of confusion. It requires enduring the feeling of having no ground to stand on for a few moments. The brain resists this at first, but it learns. It realizes that identity doesn't dissolve when certainty falls. That belonging doesn't disappear when doubt appears. That personal value isn't conditional on knowing everything. This understanding changes one's relationship with the world. With information. With opinions. With decisions. The person begins to listen more and react less. To investigate more and assert less. Not out of insecurity but out of clarity. They understand that true knowledge is not a fixed state, but a continuous process of revision. And this is where something begins to align profoundly. Because when the brain accepts that not knowing is part of the process, it becomes more curious, more flexible, and better prepared to deal with the complexity of reality. The need to close stories quickly diminishes. The urgency for certainty gives way to more refined attention. And in this space, more conscious decisions begin to emerge. But this openness doesn't come without an emotional cost. It requires overcoming initial discomfort. It requires letting the ego relax. It requires abandoning the armor of apparent confidence. And it is precisely this point that many people avoid, even feeling that something there could be liberating. Because ultimately, admitting "I don't know" isn't just an intellectual gesture. It's an act of psychological courage. An important step on the journey of mental maturity. And when that step is taken, even timidly, something begins to reorganize itself within the mind. It is precisely this internal movement, this silent shift from certainty to curiosity, that opens up space to understand something even deeper about how the brain can learn to live with uncertainty without turning it into an enemy. If this idea resonated with you in any way, write it in the comments. That makes sense to me. And if you've made it this far, it's because this conversation has resonated with you in some way. Not as a ready-made answer, but as a question that has been echoing. And that, in itself, says a lot about your curiosity and your openness to looking at the mind in a more honest way. If this content helped you see "I don't know" in a new light, consider subscribing to the channel. The idea here is precisely that, to create a space where we can explore the inner workings of the brain, question automatic certainties, and understand why we think, feel, and decide the way we do, without rushing and without easy answers. If you feel like it, leave a like on the video. Not as a mechanical gesture, but as a sign that this exchange made sense to you. This helps this type of conversation continue and reach more people who may also be experiencing this same silent discomfort of doubt. And write a simple sentence in the comments to tell me that you stayed until the end. It could be something like, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end, I read," and that helps keep this space alive, human, and connected. Now, there's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic. If you want to continue this journey of reflection and curiosity, click there and follow along. The conversation doesn't have to end here.